November 8th, 1942, off the coast of Algeria. An American army that has never really been tested is about to find out how hard this war is going to be. The transports sit in a long line on the dark water. Below decks are soldiers who have never heard a shot fired in anger. Ahead, French guns cover the approaches to the port of Oran and the beaches near the small town of Arzew. Radio reports are confused, landing craft are late, and no one knows whether the Vichy French forces will stand aside or fight. On one of those ships, a 54-year-old general who failed to graduate from West Point tightens his chin strap and gets ready to go ashore. Over the next 3 years, in North Africa, Sicily, and then across Western Europe, the units he leads will give him a reputation as the American general who never lost a battle. His name is Terry de la Meza Allen, the man whose units gave him a reputation as the American general who never lost a battle. Long before North Africa, Allen had already stepped outside the usual pattern for an American general. He entered West Point in 1907, struggled with the academics, and never completed the course. Later accounts say he tried more than once before being dismissed. For many officers of his generation, that would have ended any prospect of higher command. Allen instead went to Catholic University in Washington, earned a degree, and received his commission through ROTC. He became a cavalry officer in an army where graduates of the academy dominated the senior ranks, and biographers note that many of those academy men tended to see him as an outsider. In the First World War, he built his reputation in combat. He personally led patrols into no man's land, was wounded twice, and finished the war commanding an infantry battalion while still in his early 30s. Men who served with him later recalled a commander who liked to be forward and who paid more attention to whether his soldiers could fight than to the exact state of their uniforms. As the United States began to arm again for another war in the late 1930s, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall was looking for field commanders who would willingly close with an enemy, not just manage administration. In October 1940, Marshall reached past more senior officers and promoted Terry Allen to brigadier general. The jump provoked some resentment inside the officer corps, but Marshall clearly judged that this tough non-West Pointer was the sort of leader a rapidly expanding army would need. By 1942, Allen was a major general in command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, and on the dark water off Algeria, he was about to take that division into its first major amphibious assault. The plan for Operation Torch looked straightforward on paper. A central task force, including the 1st Infantry Division, would land near Oran, seize the port, and push inland. Western and Eastern task forces, aimed at Casablanca and Algiers, would do the same in their sectors. In theory, French resistance might collapse once local commanders saw the scale of the Allied force. In practice, the landings around Oran were confused from the first wave. Shoals and sandbars pushed landing craft off course. French coastal batteries and shore positions fired on the incoming Americans. The 1st Ranger Battalion had to silence the key battery at Arzew by direct assault. Communications between ships and the beaches were unreliable. In those first hours, no one could be sure whether the French would quickly stand down or dig in for an extended fight. Officers who served with Allen said he disliked the way his division was split among several headquarters, with different parts of the Big Red one answering to different commanders and radios, but he could not change that structure, and instead concentrated on pushing his own units forward. By the time the Oran fighting ended on November 10th, 1942, the division had taken more than 400 battle casualties, including 94 killed, many more seriously wounded, and men listed as missing in the confusion of the opening days. For an American public that had not yet seen sustained ground combat in Europe, reports from North Africa were a harsh introduction to modern war. Torch became a crash course. American commanders found out how fragile their communications could be, how awkward shared command with British and French partners was in practice, and how much their inexperienced troops still had to learn about German and Italian tactics. For Terry Allen, North Africa became the place where he began to turn the Big Red one from a newly committed unit into a seasoned formation that was much more dangerous to fight. The winter of 1942 to 1943 is hard on everyone in North Africa. After the Torch landings, the fight for Tunisia turns into a long campaign in bad weather and rough country. In February 1943, American forces suffer their worst setback of the war so far at Kasserine Pass. Under Second Corps Commander Lloyd Fredendall, American units are scattered, badly placed, and poorly coordinated. German forces under Erwin Rommel punch through several positions, send troops reeling back, and capture or destroy a great deal of equipment. As later writers put it, the idea that American ground forces would have an easy time of it dies in the Tunisian hills. The 1st Infantry Division is part of that wider struggle. Allen sees firsthand what happens when an inexperienced army faces seasoned German armor without a solid doctrine for how to meet it. He cannot rewrite the plan for the whole theatre, but he can try to make sure that his own division does not again give the enemy such easy opportunities. A month later, at El Guetar, the German 10th Panzer Division that had taken part in the Kasserine fighting runs into a better prepared American formation. The Big Red One is dug in along the approaches to a key road supported by minefields, artillery that has been pre-registered on likely targets, and tank destroyer battalions sighted for the job they were intended to do. Just after dawn on March 23rd, 1943, about 50 German tanks move down the valley. They overrun some forward positions, and accounts from the time say that 2 tanks came close enough to threaten Allen's headquarters. Those same accounts say he refused to pull his command post back and let the defenses work. The German advance runs into the minefields, bunches up, and stalls. American artillery and tank destroyers, including M10s and older gun motor carriages, open fire. Within hours, many German tanks are burning or disabled. A second attack that afternoon meets the same wall of fire. By nightfall, 10th, Panzer has been stopped. El Guetar does not end the Tunisian campaign, and it is not the work of one man, but to the soldiers of the 1st Division, it shows something that Kasserine had thrown into doubt. That an American division, given time to learn and to dig in, can stand directly against one of Germany's veteran armoured formations and hold the line. For Allen, later observers say, the battle reinforced his preference for quick decisions, careful preparation, and a habit of staying close to the areas of greatest risk. On July 10, 1943, Allen and his division are in the first wave again, this time on the southern coast of Sicily, landing near the town of Gela. Operation Husky is the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. High winds and heavy seas scatter many landing craft, and airborne drops are badly dispersed. The Gela beachhead comes under heavy pressure. German and Italian armoured units from the Hermann Göring Division and the Italian Livorno Division counterattack. Tanks push toward the beaches over open ground, trying to drive the Americans back into the sea. Some reports place enemy armour within a couple of thousand yards of the waterline. Doctrine would suggest pulling back, calling for more naval gunfire, and regrouping. Allen relies on naval support, and American cruisers and destroyers fire repeatedly at enemy concentrations, but he also depends on the infantry on the beaches. American soldiers in slit trenches and foxholes stay in place, in many cases letting tanks move over or past them rather than breaking cover. When the following German infantry appears in the open, they are hit with small arms, machine guns, and artillery. Tanks that advance too far without support are picked off by naval gunfire and anti-tank weapons. Officers who served with Allen later pointed to the Gela crisis as typical of his way of fighting, close to the front, willing to accept calculated risks and confident that well-trained troops could hold even under very heavy pressure. After the beachhead is secure, the campaign pushes north into Sicily's mountainous interior. The key objective is the hill town of Troina, the highest town on the island and a cornerstone of the German defensive line. From July 31, 1943 to early August 1943, Allen's 1st Division and attached units fight a hard, week-long series of engagements for the ridges and heights around the town. The Americans bring major firepower to bear. 9 battalions of 105mm howitzers, 6 battalions of 155mm guns, and a battalion of 155mm pieces, commonly called Long Toms, roughly 165 guns in all, pound German positions day and night, supported by airstrikes when the weather allows. German units launch repeated counterattacks, and some accounts speak of more than 20 separate efforts to drive the Americans off the heights. By the time the fighting for Troina and the surrounding high ground ends, the 1st Division and its attachments have taken roughly 1,700 casualties over about 19 days of mountain operations, and have captured around 6,000 prisoners. The battles open the road through central Sicily and help set the conditions for the eventual Axis evacuation of the island. For people reading the war news at home, Terry Allen suddenly appears as one of the public faces of this harder, more experienced army. Time magazine puts him on the cover in 1943 and presents him as a rising division commander. War correspondent Ernie Pyle writes admiringly about his rough manner with subordinates and his lack of interest in ceremony. The man who had failed to graduate from West Point now appears in print as one of the United States Army's most effective field leaders. At the same time, while the press is praising him, tension is building among some senior commanders. In Sicily, Allen's division is not only known to the enemy, it also gains a reputation in the rear areas. Contemporary reports describe many of his men as proud and aggressive, and sometimes openly dismissive of non-combat units. Accounts from those rear areas mention heavy drinking when leave is available and a casual attitude to saluting. They also note that the soldiers mirror a commander who, observers say, cares more about fighting ability than parade ground precision. To some senior officers, that trade-off looks acceptable. George Patton, who watches the division in action, praises its offensive spirit. Others, especially Omar Bradley, see a growing problem. In his later memoirs, Bradley writes that divisions must stay under strict discipline in the rear if they are to endure a long war. He criticizes what he saw as Allen's relaxed image and says that in his view, Allen had shown that lack of discipline undermined good soldiering. In August 1943, while the Sicily campaign is still underway, Allen receives word from 2nd Corps headquarters that he and his assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., are being relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. The official reasons focus on discipline and the belief that the division needs tighter control before it takes on larger operations. Allen does not contest the decision in public. Officers who were present recalled that he ended his farewell briefing to his staff in tears and then left the division he had led through North Africa and Sicily. For many generals, a relief in the middle of a campaign marks the end of any realistic chance of another combat command. The decision in Allen's case is severe, but it is not straightforward. Under his command, the 1st Division had become one of the most effective American formations in the Mediterranean, and at the same time a source of concern in the rear areas. Historians and veterans still argue over whether Bradley was right to remove him when he did, or whether the wartime army had little space for a commander who did not separate frontline culture from garrison discipline in the way the high command preferred. Back in the United States, Allen could have been left in training posts, as often happened to relieved commanders, but senior leaders brought him back into a field role. On October 15, 1943, he took over the 104th Infantry Division, then training at Camp Adair in Oregon. It was a newly activated unit, largely made up of draftees and junior officers with no combat experience, and it carried the nickname Timberwolves. From the start, accounts from the division say Allen set out to make it different from the standard American infantry pattern. He cut back on parade ground drill and formal ceremony and concentrated on realistic field work, and on one speciality in particular, night fighting. Standard American doctrine at the time assumed that most major attacks would go in at dawn, under heavy artillery and air support, and that night operations were inherently more risky. Allen took a different view. Veterans recall that he drilled his men to move, navigate, and coordinate in darkness until it felt natural. Map-reading exercises were run after sunset. Units practiced silent movement, hand signals, and ways to keep units together without shouting or bright lights. Division histories talk about periods of week after week in which night problems, marches, and simulated assaults took up much of the schedule, more than most American divisions gave to that subject. Out of this came a simple internal slogan that men repeated among themselves, that nothing in hell was supposed to stop the Timberwolves. For Allen, those words summed up a method. The division was to find the enemy, pin him in place, move under cover of darkness, and strike from an angle he did not expect. If the division could do that, he believed, it could overcome its lack of prior combat experience. In September 1944, the Timberwolves sailed for Europe and moved not to North Africa or Sicily, where Allen had fought before, but into the flooded lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands. By October 1944, the Allies had captured the port of Antwerp but could not use it because German forces still held the Scheldt estuary, the waterways and coastal positions that shipping had to pass to reach the harbour. Clearing that area fell to the Canadian First Army under the wider command of Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, and the fighting there was heavy and took place in flooded fields and along narrow causeways. Into that setting came Allen's new division. On October 23, 1944, the 104th entered combat in Belgium and the southern Netherlands, attached to Canadian formations. It relieved worn-down British units on parts of the line and went straight into offensive operations. This was where Allen's training ideas were tested in battle. Instead of waiting for set-piece daylight bombardments, Timberwolf battalions often attacked in the dark. They advanced quietly, using bayonets and grenades and firing rifles and machine guns only when they judged it necessary, in order to avoid giving away their positions with flashes. In the wet night, they picked their way between German strongpoints, slipped through gaps, and hit machine gun nests and artillery positions from close range. Canadian and British commanders, who had been cautious about this untried American division, soon revised their view. Official letters of commendation praised what they called the dash of the 104th once it was engaged, and units on both flanks noticed that the Timberwolves seemed to prefer closing in after dark rather than waiting for large daylight attacks. The cost was significant. By November 7th, 1944, after a little more than 2 weeks of fighting in the Scheldt operations, the division had taken 1,426 casualties, including 313 killed and 103 missing. But German defences along the estuary were broken, and the Royal Navy could begin clearing mines and opening the route to Antwerp for Allied shipping before winter. For the second time in the war, Allen had taken a relatively new American formation into one of the hardest campaigns in a theatre, and shown that it could operate alongside experienced Allied units. This time, even cautious staff officers took note that the night attack doctrine was not just a training experiment. After the Scheldt, fighting the 104th was reassigned to the United States First Army. By late 1944, it was operating on the approaches to Cologne, breaking into parts of the German Siegfried Line, and then pushing on into the industrial region of the Ruhr. When Omar Bradley arrived to inspect the division, the visit carried an obvious personal edge, because this was the same senior commander who had relieved Allen of the 1st Division in Sicily the year before. Now he was looking at a different formation, one that had only been in combat for a few months but was already being mentioned in reports alongside some of the most experienced American divisions in Europe. Bradley later wrote that he had been surprised by how quickly the 104th had, in his view, become a first-rank assault division. Accounts from the time say that Allen, in keeping with his usual style, replied with a mixture of pride and humour, putting his Timberwolves in the same company as veteran divisions, such as the 1st and 9th, and saying that they belonged there. For Allen, people close to him later suggested, this was about as close as he came to formal vindication. The general, who had once been judged too lax and unorthodox to keep the big red one, was now in charge of a division that senior leaders regarded as one of the reliable shock formations in Northwest Europe. In early 1945, the Timberwolves kept moving. They fought through the Roer and Rhine campaigns, taking part in crossings of the Roer River in February, and then moving across the Rhine through the Remagen bridgehead in March. Once over the river, they drove into central Germany, and at times moved faster than German commanders could rebuild defensive lines. On April 11, 1945, elements of the division reached the area around Nordhausen in Thuringia. There, they found a complex of camps linked to the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp system, where prisoners had been forced to work on V-2 rockets in underground tunnels. The soldiers came across thousands of corpses that had not yet been buried, and hundreds of starving survivors barely able to move. United States Army authorities ordered local civilians to help bury the dead and arranged medical care for those still alive. For Timberwolf soldiers who had spent months thinking in terms of bridges, crossroads, and enemy strongpoints, Nordhausen gave the war a different focus, because they could see in one place the human cost behind the industrial system they had been attacking. 4 days later, The division was fighting its way into Halle, an important city on the Saale River with bridges and factories, and a local Nazi leadership that did not initially want to give up the town. At that point, an unusual figure entered the story. Felix Graf von Luckner, a German nobleman known for his commerce raiding in the First World War. Contemporary accounts describe von Luckner acting as a go-between between Allen and German officers, who were hesitating between further resistance and surrender. Through those talks and a limited use of force, the Americans secured the capitulation of the city, and Halle was spared the kind of prolonged street fighting that had badly damaged other German urban centers. By late April, the division had reached positions along the Mulde and Elbe line. On April 26, 1945, Timberwolf patrols reached the area around Prech and made contact with Soviet troops, one of several link-ups between American and Red Army units along the Elbe in the last days of the war in Europe. When contact with the enemy ended on May 5, 1945, the 104th had been in continuous combat for about 195 days. Over the course of its campaign, it had taken nearly 5,000 battle casualties, roughly 1,000 killed and several thousand wounded. People who knew Allen said that these totals mattered to him. They recalled that he had always insisted that aggressive tactics should not turn into careless waste of life. And after the war, he said that he prayed for operations to succeed with as few losses to the division as possible. In his mind, speed and shock were tools to shorten battles and reduce the time his men had to spend under fire, not goals in themselves. People who served with Terry Allen often said his style was not subtle. He was blunt with his officers and noticeably indifferent to parade polish, but those who watched him work also saw a firm view of what made soldiers fight. He did not usually speak in terms of saving humanity or distant ideals, and instead talked, veterans recalled, about pride in the unit and the fear of letting down the men on either side. He liked to say that a soldier mainly fought to show that his own outfit was the best in the army, and that he had as much courage as anyone standing with him. His way of leading matched that outlook. He was often visible near the front, not, his contemporaries said, for show, but because he believed that if he asked men to hold a line under fire or move through a dark wood full of enemy positions, they should see that he was willing to be close to that danger as well. In North Africa, in Sicily, and later with the Timberwolves in northwest Europe, that habit of pushing his own headquarters forward became part of his reputation. At the same time, the record from Tunisia, Sicily, Holland, and Germany shows that Allen did not simply improvise without plans. In Tunisia, he backed the creation of prepared defensive belts, with minefields, anti-tank guns, and artillery registered in advance that helped his division blunt the 10th Panzer Division at El Guetar. In Sicily, he was involved in coordinating heavy artillery at Troina on a scale that matched anything the United States Army had previously used in such terrain. In the Netherlands and in Germany, he pressed his divisions to use night attacks not as wild charges in the dark, but as rehearsed methods for slipping past strong points and trying to keep casualties down. Many observers felt that what set him apart was the speed with which he was willing to act once he thought he understood a situation, in a war where many commanders preferred to pause and request more information. Allen was more likely to order an attack at night, adjust a line quickly, or move his headquarters closer to the front rather than further away. That energy worried some superiors and gave confidence to many subordinates. By 1945, the overall record was clear enough that, under Allen, both the 1st Infantry Division in North Africa and Sicily and the 104th Infantry Division in Northwest Europe had built reputations as assault formations that did not break easily under pressure and did not turn away from demanding missions. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The 104th returned to the United States that summer, and Allen retired from active duty in 1946. He eventually settled in El Paso, Texas. Biographers note that, like many senior officers who had sent large numbers of men into battle, he lived with the weight of those decisions long after the fighting stopped. The war also remained close to his family in another way. His only child, Terry de la Mesa Allen Jr., followed him into the army and became an officer in the 1st Infantry Division, the same big red one his father had led in North Africa and Sicily. During the Vietnam War, Allen Jr. commanded a battalion in the division's 28th Infantry Regiment, In October 1967, he was killed in action near the village of Ongtan during one of the conflict's hard-fought engagements. People who knew the older Allen said the loss struck him very deeply. The man who had spent the Second World War asking for courage from other men's sons now lost his own in another distant campaign. Less than 2 years later, in 1969, Terry Allen Sr. died. Father and son were buried together at Fort Bliss National Cemetery. Their two graves, one for a general of North Africa and Europe and one for a lieutenant colonel of Vietnam, trace not only a family story but also a longer line through 20th century American wars, a reminder that behind every doctrine and every reputation for boldness or caution there are families who live with the outcome. Looking back, many historians see Allen's career as challenging several easy assumptions. It shows that an officer can fail to graduate from the standard academy path and still, through another route and under the pressures of a major war, become one of the United States Army's more effective field commanders. It also highlights the debate over discipline, because under Allen's strict parade ground standards and combat performance did not always move in step, and senior officers disagreed sharply over where to draw that line. His record offers one answer to a basic question every army faces about when to move fast and when to wait. At Oran and Gila, Allen pushed forward under fire instead of delaying for perfect coordination. At El Guetar and Troina, he linked careful preparation to a refusal to pull back from forward positions simply because enemy tanks were close or counterattacks repeated. In the Netherlands and in Germany, he used night attacks and quick advances to try to shorten the time his men spent under well-prepared defensive fire. Again and again, he chose speed and pressure over long pauses, but he did so after training his units to take advantage of that pace rather than be undone by it. There is no single battle in which Terry Allen alone decided the outcome of a campaign. What his career shows instead is how a commander with a consistent way of thinking, fight close to the front, move faster than the enemy expects, and drill one key skill until it is second nature, can take different formations in different theaters and turn them into reliable assault divisions. From the beaches of North Africa, through the heights of Sicily, to the flooded ground of the Scheldt and the industrial sites around Nordhausen, accounts of Allen focus less on any idea of effortless genius and more on a steady refusal to settle for half measures. In a war where hesitation and confusion often cost lives, his answer, as he later described it, was to prepare as thoroughly as time allowed, move before the enemy was ready, and keep pressing until the objective was taken. Many of his soldiers remembered that combination of intensity in battle and concern about losses as the reason they were willing to follow him into very dark situations, whether that meant the surf at Gila or a night attack in a Dutch forest. That is the sense in which the title, How Terry Allen's Unthinkable Tactics Won America. Its hardest battle can be understood, not as a claim about one specific engagement, but as a story about the long effort to turn an untested army into a force that could meet and defeat the best that the Axis put in front of it.